In a quiet town almost forgotten by time, where the streets whispered stories only the wind could hear, one small act of kindness set into motion a chain of miracles no one could have predicted. It all began with a broken car and a choice made under a cold, relentless rain. Tonight, we invite you to step into a story about second chances, the quiet strength of ordinary hearts, and the unexpected places where true love takes root. Stay with us. You won't want to miss how this simple moment changed everything. If you enjoy heartwarming stories that inspire hope and celebrate the beauty of everyday courage, consider subscribing to our channel. We'd love to have you join our growing community of dreamers, believers, and storytellers. Now let's begin. The rain had come suddenly, drumming against the cracked sidewalks and the rusted roofs of Cedar Hollow, like an old familiar song. The town had always been a little sleepy, but tonight, under the misty veil of spring rain, it seemed positively forgotten, except for the lone light flickering above Parker's auto repair. Inside, Evan Parker leaned over the hood of a battered pickup truck, his fingers numb despite the thin gloves he wore. It was past closing time, but the old Ford belonged to Mr. Hanley, the widower down the street who relied on it to get to his part-time job at the mill. Evan hadn't had the heart to turn him away. He tightened the last bolt, wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better days, and rolled his shoulders. A dull ache radiated through his spine, a reminder of too many nights spent bending over engines and too many years spent carrying the weight of promises he couldn't afford to break. He had just reached for his jacket when the garage's landline shrieked to life, a grating sound against the soothing rhythm of the rain. Evan hesitated. No one ever called this late unless it was trouble. With a sigh, he picked up. "Parker's Auto," he said, voice rough from disuse. A woman's voice answered, trembling and rushed. I'm sorry to bother you. My car, it's dead. I'm stuck near the old mill road. I didn't know who else to call." Evan rubbed his temple. He could picture it already. Another stranded motorist, another cold night. He could tell her the garage was closed, that she should wait until morning, but the voice on the other end wasn't demanding. It was vulnerable, afraid. He exhaled slowly. "Stay where you are. I'll find you," he said, surprising even himself. The battered tow truck coughed to life after 3 stubborn tries. Evan flipped up the collar of his jacket, shoved his cap lower against the rain, and pulled onto the slick streets of Cedar Hollow, headlights cutting shallow tunnels through the mist. 15 minutes later, he found her. The car, a cherry red classic Mustang, sat awkwardly on the shoulder, its hood half popped open like a wounded bird. Beside it, illuminated by his headlights, stood a woman in a raincoat that looked far too thin for the weather. She clutched her purse to her chest like a shield. Evan parked, grabbed his flashlight, and approached. "You the one who called?" he asked, keeping his tone even, gentle. She turned, and even in the dim light, he caught the flicker of fear in her eyes before she masked it with a polite, practiced smile. "Yes, thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was soft, cultured in a way that didn't fit this tired little town. Evan gave a small nod and crouched by the hood. A quick glance told him enough. The battery was dead. Completely. Probably left the lights on, he thought, but he kept the judgment to himself. "Looks like you'll need a jump, maybe even a replacement battery," he said. "Garage is about 5 miles back. Can tow you there." I, I don't want to impose," she said quickly. "I can call someone." "Not much point tonight," Evan interrupted kindly. "Only other garage is 30 miles north, and they're closed anyway." For a moment, she seemed to wrestle with herself, then finally nodded. "All right." He hooked up the cables in the rain, his hands slipping slightly. She stood silently by, watching him with an intensity that made him oddly self-conscious. Not judgmental, just present, in a way few people were. As he finished, she fumbled with her purse. "Please," she said, pulling out a crisp bill, "at least let me pay you for your trouble." Evan shook his head, a small, tired smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You don't owe me anything. Just bad luck and bad timing. Happens to all of us." The surprise on her face wasn't feigned. It was raw, like she couldn't remember the last time someone had helped her without expecting something in return. "Thank you," she whispered, voice barely audible over the rain. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Let's get you somewhere dry." The drive back to Parker's auto was silent but strangely comfortable. Evan stole glances at her when he could. She stared out the window, raindrops tracing paths down the glass, her features lit in soft, melancholy lines by the dashboard glow. Back at the garage, Evan pulled her car into the bay and began the work of swapping out the battery. It was tedious, exacting work, but his hands moved automatically. Midnight came and went. When he finally finished, Evan stepped back, feeling the familiar wave of exhaustion slam into him. He locked the tools away, wiped the grease from his hands, and turned to tell her the car was ready. But the words never made it out. The world tilted sharply. The concrete floor rushed up to meet him. He collapsed hard, the last thing he heard before the dark swallowed him being a sharp gasp, and the frantic sound of footsteps running toward him. The sharp, sterile scent of antiseptic flooded Evan's senses as he drifted back into consciousness. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The harsh fluorescent lights above him buzzed faintly, casting an unforgiving glare over the small hospital room. Then he heard it, a soft murmur, low and rhythmic, like someone talking in their sleep. Turning his head with some effort, he saw her. The woman from the road, the one with the rain-soaked coat and the desperate eyes, was slumped in the chair beside his bed. Her blonde hair was pulled back loosely, strands escaping around her face. She had fallen asleep sitting up, her head resting against the wall, one hand still curled loosely around the edge of his blanket, as if anchoring herself to him. For a long moment, Evan simply stared. Why would she stay? He was a nobody, a mechanic barely making ends meet in a town that most people couldn't even find on a map. People like her, they didn't linger for people like him. As if sensing his gaze, she stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and when she realized he was awake, relief flooded her features. "You're awake," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "Thank God." Evan tried to sit up, but the effort sent a spike of dizziness through him. He groaned and fell back against the pillows. "Easy," she said quickly, leaning forward. "You fainted. The doctor said it was exhaustion and dehydration. You really scared me." "You didn't have to." His voice was hoarse, the words thick on his tongue. "Stay." She smiled then, a soft, genuine thing that lit up her face far more than the fancy clothes she had worn earlier. "I couldn't just leave you," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Evan didn't know what to say to that. In his experience, most people would have driven off without a backward glance. "How long was I out?" he managed. "Couple of hours. It's still night," she said. "They wanted to keep you for observation. But you'll be okay. You just need to take better care of yourself." A small, wry chuckle escaped him despite the lingering pain. "Story of my life." She smiled again, a little sadly this time. Then after a beat, she extended her hand. "I'm Lottie," she said. "Lottie Whitmore." Evan blinked at the name. It tugged at something in the back of his mind, something he couldn't quite place. But he shook her hand anyway, his own calloused and rough against her softer skin. "Evan Parker," he said, "owner of the finest rundown garage in Cedar Hollow." Lottie laughed, a real laugh this time, light and musical. "Well, Mr. Parker, I think you saved me tonight." He shrugged, feeling oddly embarrassed by the praise. "Just doing my job." Her eyes softened. "No, you went way beyond that. Most people wouldn't have come out in the rain at midnight. Most people wouldn't have worked themselves to collapse for a stranger." She said it with such earnestness that Evan had to look away, staring at the outdated wallpaper peeling in the corner instead. "I've been on my own a long time," he said gruffly. "You learn that, if you don't look out for people, no one will." Lottie didn't respond right away. Instead, she sat back in her chair, pulling the hospital blanket tighter around herself. There was something fragile in her posture now, something that mirrored the ache in Evan's chest. "I know what that's like," she said quietly. "More than you might think." Their eyes met then, a silent understanding passing between them. Two strangers adrift, recognizing the loneliness in each other. A soft knock interrupted the moment. A nurse poked her head in, smiling warmly. "Feeling better, Mr. Parker?" Evan nodded weakly. "Good. I'll start the discharge papers. You'll need to rest, drink fluids, eat something real," she said, wagging a playful finger at him. "No more heroics, okay? Evan managed a crooked grin. When the nurse left, Lottie stood, stretching out her cramped limbs. "I'll give you a ride back to your garage," she offered. "Your tow truck's still there." "You don't have to," Evan said automatically. "I know," she said with a twinkle in her eye. "But maybe I want to." He couldn't argue with that. The ride back to Parker's auto was quieter than before, but not uncomfortable. The rain had eased into a gentle mist, and the streets glistened under the street lamps. Lottie drove slowly, as if reluctant to reach their destination too quickly. "You really love this town?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Evan glanced out at the empty sidewalks, the shuttered storefronts. "I guess," he said after a moment. "It's home, even when it ain't easy." "Income." Lottie nodded thoughtfully, tapping her fingers lightly against the steering wheel. "I used to come here when I was a kid," she said. "Summers with my grandmother. She had a little house just past Miller's Pond." Evan raised an eyebrow. Miller's Pond was practically a ghost town now, just a few abandoned cabins and memories half swallowed by the woods. "Why'd you stop coming?" he asked. Lottie's smile faltered. "Life got complicated," she said. "Families have a way of doing that." Evan understood more than she could know. He didn't press. They reached the garage, its single overhead lamp buzzing weakly. Evan got out slowly, testing his legs. He turned back to her, unsure what to say. "Thank you," he said finally, "for the ride, for staying." Lottie smiled, and for the first time Evan saw the woman behind the polished facade. Not the heiress, not the stranger, but a real person, carrying invisible bruises, just like he did. "Get some rest, Mr. Parker," she said. "The town's not going anywhere." She drove off into the mist, her taillights disappearing down the empty street, leaving Evan standing under the buzzing light, feeling the strangest thing he had felt in years: hope. The rain had slowed to a whisper by the time Evan locked up Parker's auto and made his way to the small apartment above the garage. His legs still felt unsteady, and there was a dull throb at the base of his skull, but he waved off the concern gnawing at the back of his mind. He had weathered worse. Inside, the apartment was neat but sparse. A sagging couch, a battered coffee table, a kitchenette with mismatched dishes. It wasn't much, but it was his. Evan shrugged off his jacket, hung it on the same hook he'd used for years, and collapsed into the worn armchair by the window. He watched the mist drift along Main Street, softening the harsh outlines of the world. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel entirely alone. Her name echoed in his mind: Lottie Whitmore. There was something haunting about it, as if it carried a weight she hadn't yet spoken aloud. He shook his head. Best not to think about it. She was just passing through. People like her always were. Still, her kindness lingered like the scent of rain on warm asphalt, refusing to be brushed aside. The next morning, the weak sunlight struggled through the overcast sky. Evan woke to the sharp rap of knuckles against his door. He frowned, pulling on a sweatshirt before making his way downstairs. He wasn't expecting customers. Not this early. When he swung open the door, he found Lottie standing there, a to-go cup of coffee in one hand and a brown paper bag in the other. She smiled shyly. "I figured you could use some breakfast," she said. Evan blinked, thrown off balance. Thanks," he said, stepping aside to let her in. The smell of fresh coffee and warm cinnamon filled the garage, a welcome reprieve from the usual metallic tang of oil and grease. Lottie perched on the edge of a workbench, handing him the coffee. "You look better this morning," she said, studying him with genuine concern. "Feel better too," Evan lied. The truth was, the exhaustion still clung to him like a second skin, but pride wouldn't let him admit it. She didn't press. Instead, she sipped her own coffee, her gaze wandering over the walls lined with old photographs. Snapshots of Cedar Hollow's better days, smiling customers, a much younger Evan standing proudly beside his first toolbox. "You've been here a long time," she said softly. "All my life," he replied. "Never had much reason to leave." Lottie nodded, absently tracing the rim of her cup. "My grandmother used to say Cedar Hollow was the kind of place that stayed in your blood," she murmured. "No matter how far you went." Evan smiled faintly. "Sounds about right." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, the quiet broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. Finally, Lottie set down her cup. "I was wondering, would you mind showing me around town?" she asked. "It's been years, and I barely remember anything. Evan hesitated. It wasn't that he didn't want to spend more time with her, it was that he did, and he wasn't sure what that meant. But when he looked at her, at the hopeful, almost wistful expression on her face, he found himself nodding. Sure, he said. I can do that. Cedar Hollow wasn't much to look at these days. Many of the storefronts on Main Street stood empty, their windows dusty and forgotten. The diner still hung on, though, the neon sign for Maggie's Place flickering stubbornly against the daylight. As they walked, Lottie listened intently as Evan pointed out landmarks. The old movie theater that had closed 5 years ago, the bookstore that doubled as the town's de facto meeting hall, the tiny park where the summer festivals used to be held. It's sad, Lottie said quietly, pausing in front of the boarded-up general store. It feels hollow. Evan shrugged, hands stuffed deep into his jacket pockets. Town started dying when the mill shut down, he said. Folks moved away. Ones who stayed, well, we make do. Lottie turned to him then, her brow furrowed. Why did you stay? Evan considered that for a long moment. Because it's home, he said finally. Good or bad, you don't just walk away from that. Lottie looked away, her jaw tightening slightly. Evan caught the shadow that crossed her face but said nothing. He knew the look of someone wrestling with ghosts. They ended their tour at Miller's Pond, a stretch of water bordered by wild reeds and sagging willow trees. The pond mirrored the gray sky, its surface still and glassy. Lottie stood at the edge, hugging herself against the chill. I used to come here with my grandmother, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She taught me how to skip stones. She picked up a flat pebble and turned it over in her hand. I used to think this place was magic, she said, back when I believed in that sort of thing. Evan crouched by the water, selecting a stone of his own. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he sent it skimming across the surface, leaving a trail of ripples behind. Maybe it still is, he said. Lottie laughed, a sound that was equal parts wonder and sadness. I don't know, she said. I think somewhere along the way, I forgot how to believe. Evan stood, brushing the dirt from his jeans. Maybe you just need a reason to remember. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away. The boarded-up shops, the empty streets, the rain-streaked memories. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lottie felt a flicker of warmth inside her chest. Small but undeniable. Maybe magic wasn't about fairy tales and miracles. Maybe it was about finding something, or someone, that made you believe again. Evan had never been the kind of man to believe in fate. Life was simpler when things were mechanical, when problems had clear causes and fixes. Engines made sense. People didn't. And yet, as he stood beside Lottie at Miller's Pond, watching her absent-mindedly toss stones into the still water, he felt something shift, something subtle, something dangerous, something he wasn't sure he had the right to feel. She broke the silence first, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Tell me about you, she said, glancing over at him with a small smile. About Evan Parker. He chuckled dryly. Not much to tell. Grew up here, worked here, stayed here. That's about it. But Lottie didn't look away. She simply waited, patient and unpressing, and somehow that made it harder to hide. Evan sighed, picking up a pebble and rolling it between his fingers. My mom and I lived above the garage, he began. Dad left before I could remember him. Mom kept things going. She was tough, kind of woman who could fix a carburetor and bake a pie in the same afternoon. Lottie smiled softly, encouraging him without a word. She got sick when I was about 20, Evan continued. I dropped out of college to take care of her. Never went back. He shrugged as if it didn't matter, though the ache of it still throbbed on rainy days like an old wound. That's a lot for a kid to take on, Lottie said quietly. Had to be done, he said simply. Family's family. He didn't mention the nights spent rationing medicine, the mounting bills, the helpless anger when the doctors shook their heads. Some things didn't need to be said aloud. They were stitched into the fabric of him, like the calluses on his hands. And your mom? Lottie asked gently. She passed a few years back. Evan stared out over the water, his voice steady but distant. Never wanted me to give up the garage. Said Cedar Hollow needed places like this, places where people could still trust a handshake. For a long moment, they said nothing. Just two people standing in the quiet ruins of old dreams. Finally, Lottie spoke, her voice low. My mother died when I was 11, she said. Cancer. Quick and cruel. Evan looked at her then, really looked, seeing not just the polished woman with the perfect hair and expensive boots, but the little girl still carrying grief in her pocket, like a stone she couldn't put down. My father, he didn't know how to handle it, Lottie went on. He threw himself into work, built Whitmore Holdings into an empire. I guess I should be grateful. She gave a brittle laugh. He provided everything. Private schools, luxury vacations, anything money could buy. Evan didn't interrupt. He recognized the undercurrent in her voice, the weight of things left unsaid. But he didn't know how to be there, she said softly. Not really. She turned to face him, and there was no pretense now, no armor, just raw honesty. I grew up learning that love was something you earned, she said, with achievements, appearances, perfection. Evan's chest tightened painfully. And now, he asked quietly. Lottie gave a small, sad smile. Now I'm not sure I believe in it at all. A gust of wind stirred the reeds, sending a ripple across the surface of the pond. Evan took a slow breath, feeling the familiar urge to fix something he couldn't even begin to touch. You're wrong, he said, his voice rough. Love's not something you earn. It's something you give, freely. Lottie blinked, caught off guard by the certainty in his tone. Doesn't mean it's easy, he added, or fair, but it's real, if you let it be. The words hung between them, fragile and heavy. For a moment, Lottie seemed about to say something, something important, but then she shook her head as if clearing it and offered him a wry smile. You're a surprisingly wise mechanic, Mr. Parker, she teased lightly. He chuckled, the tension easing slightly. Don't let that get around, he said. Bad for business. They lingered a little longer at the pond, the conversation turning to lighter things. The town's eccentric mayor, the infamous pumpkin pie contest at Maggie's Diner, the time Evan had tried and failed to teach a stray dog to fetch wrenches. But underneath the laughter, something had shifted. The walls between them, carefully built and long maintained, had begun to crack. And though neither of them would have admitted it yet, something dangerous and wonderful was beginning to grow in the broken places. Later, as they walked back toward town, Lottie hesitated in front of the old general store. Its windows were clouded with dust. The closed sign faded and forgotten. You said people just moved away, she said thoughtfully. Yeah, Evan said. Places die when there's no one left to fight for them. Lottie pressed her hand against the glass, peering inside at the empty shelves. Maybe they just needed a reason to stay, she murmured. Evan watched her, a strange feeling unfurling in his chest, a mixture of hope and fear. He didn't know what Lottie Whitmore was searching for in Cedar Hollow. He didn't know if she would find it, but for the first time in a long while, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one looking for something more. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm, a tempo Cedar Hollow seemed to understand innately. It wasn't a place that demanded much. It simply was, worn and stubborn, breathing through cracked sidewalks and rusted storefronts. Lottie found herself walking the streets more often than she'd planned. At first, she told herself it was just to pass the time. Her car still needed a few more adjustments, Evan said, a supply order that would take a couple of days to arrive. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just the car keeping her here. It was something else, something harder to name. The town, though weathered, had not lost all its charm. Maggie's place still served coffee so strong it could peel paint, and pancakes the size of hubcaps. The library, tucked between an abandoned barber shop and an antique store, still kept its crooked shelves lined with worn books, their pages rich with the scent of dust and memory. And the people, though wary at first, had a way of welcoming you in small, almost invisible ways. A nod here, a smile there. It was a language Lottie was learning to read, and slowly it was stitching a kind of belonging she hadn't realized she craved. One afternoon, as she lingered in front of the community bulletin board outside the post office, she heard a voice behind her. You're the girl from the Whitmore family, aren't you? Lottie turned to find a wiry woman in her 60s, her gray hair tucked neatly beneath a sun hat. I, Lottie hesitated. Technically, that was true, but it felt so far removed from who she was now. The woman smiled, sensing her discomfort. Name's Carol Lawson. I used to work for your grandmother. Best woman I ever knew. Lottie's heart twisted. I loved her, she said quietly. Carol's eyes softened. We all did, she said. She had a way of making this town feel alive, like we mattered. They stood there a moment, the weight of shared memory filling the space between them. You staying long? Carol asked, her tone casual but curious. I'm not sure yet, Lottie admitted. Carol gave a small nod, as if that was answer enough. Well, if you decide to, you should come by the church next Saturday, she said. We're doing a town cleanup, trying to get Main Street ready for the summer festival. Lottie smiled. I'll think about it. Carol winked. You're your grandmother's girl. I can tell. You'll do the right thing. And with that, she disappeared into the post office, leaving Lottie standing there, her heart unexpectedly full. That evening, Lottie found herself back at Parker's auto. Evan was under the hood of her car, frowning in concentration. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms dusted with grease, and a smudge of oil streaked one cheekbone. He looked up as she approached, his expression shifting into something softer. Afternoon, he said. Hey, she replied, handing him a cold soda from the convenience store. Figured you could use a break. He grunted in appreciation, cracking open the can with one hand. How's the grand tour going? He asked. Lottie leaned against the garage door, watching the fading sun set the sky ablaze in colors she hadn't seen in years. Real colors, not the washed-out gray of city skylines. It's strange, she admitted. Sad but beautiful, too. Like the town's still breathing. Barely. Evan wiped his hands on a rag. She's got life left, he said. Just needs folks to believe in her again. Lottie studied him, seeing not just the man who had fixed her car or stayed by her side in the hospital, but someone who had chosen to stay and fight for a place most had abandoned. You ever think about leaving? She asked. Evan shrugged. Sure, lots of times. But it never felt right. Like if I gave up on Cedar Hollow, I'd be giving up on myself too. The simplicity of it struck her. In her world, everything had always been complicated, layered with expectation and strategy. But Evan, he was straightforward in a way that was almost revolutionary. She wanted to ask him how he did it, how he stayed so grounded when everything around him had fallen apart. But instead, she just said, I'm thinking about staying a little longer. Evan looked at her, his gaze steady. You wouldn't be the worst thing to happen to this town, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. Lottie laughed, the sound surprising even herself. High praise, Mr. Parker, she teased. He chuckled, the sound low and warm. You hungry? He asked. Maggie's is doing meatloaf night. Not fancy, but it'll fill you up. Lottie pretended to consider it gravely. I've had worse offers, she said. Dinner at Maggie's was a simple affair. Plastic booths, laminated menus, coffee that tasted faintly of burnt hope. But there was laughter too. Old friends ribbing each other, teenagers jostling for jukebox tokens, Maggie herself scolding a regular for trying to sneak an extra slice of pie. It was imperfect, messy, utterly human, and Lottie realized somewhere between the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation that she didn't want to leave just yet. Maybe not for a long time. Maybe Cedar Hollow was exactly where she needed to be. As they walked back toward the garage under a sky littered with stars, Evan spoke, his voice thoughtful. Town's like an old engine, he said. Takes work to keep it running. Patience. Faith. Lottie tilted her head, smiling. You think I'm engine material? Evan grinned. I think you've got more grit than you know. They reached the garage, and for a moment, neither moved to say goodnight. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something fragile and new. Finally, Lottie broke the silence. Good night, Evan. Good night, Lottie. As she turned toward her borrowed room at the inn, she felt his gaze lingering, steady and sure. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel quite so lost. Maybe, just maybe, she was finding her way home. The following week unfolded like the slow bloom of spring after a long winter. Quiet, almost imperceptible, but real. Lottie found herself slipping into the rhythm of Cedar Hollow with a surprising ease. Mornings started with coffee at Maggie's place. Afternoons drifted by, helping at the community garden near the old church. And evenings often ended with long walks through the sleepy streets, where the only sound was the gravel crunching underfoot and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Somewhere along the way, Evan Parker became a steady part of those days, not through grand gestures or heavy conversations, but through the small, ordinary ways that mattered more. A nod across the diner, an extra cup of coffee left on the counter at the garage, a shared laugh over the stubborn engine of Mrs. Carter's ancient sedan. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something quieter, something more solid. It was trust. One bright Saturday morning, Lottie arrived at Parker's auto with two coffees and a mischievous smile. "I thought we could call it even," she said, handing him one. Evan raised an eyebrow. "Even for what?" "For saving me from the perils of bad diner coffee," she teased. He chuckled, wiping his hands on a rag before taking the cup. "Generous of you," he said. They settled into a comfortable routine that morning, Lottie handing him tools while he worked under the hood of a battered old pickup. She wasn't much help. Evan had to show her twice how to tell a socket wrench from a ratchet, but she was willing, and that seemed to matter more. "You ever think about working in a garage?" Evan asked, half joking. Lottie grinned. "I don't think my father's corporate empire would survive the scandal." Evan smirked but didn't push. He could see glimpses of the woman she was before the weight of expectations had shaped her. Playful, curious, free. He liked that woman, a lot more than he should. That afternoon they took a break, sitting on the tailgate of Evan's truck with sandwiches from Maggie's and the sun warming their backs. Lottie swung her legs idly, gazing out at the garage's gravel lot. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked, echoing the question she had asked before. But this time, her tone was different. Less curious, more wistful. Evan shrugged. "I used to dream about it," he admitted. "Pack up and see the world. Big cities, bright lights, all that." He took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully. "But after a while, you realize, home isn't a place you find. It's something you build." Lottie was quiet for a long moment, his words settling in her chest like stones. "I don't know if I ever had that," she said finally. "You could," Evan said, glancing at her. His voice was steady, but there was something vulnerable in his eyes. "You just have to decide where to start." She smiled a little sadly. "Maybe I already have." The next day was the town cleanup event Carol had mentioned. Lottie hadn't been sure she would go. She could have easily made excuses, told herself it wasn't her place, that she was just passing through. But something inside her insisted otherwise. She showed up in jeans and an old t-shirt, hair pulled back, a pair of borrowed work gloves tucked into her pocket. Evan was already there, hauling a broken bench out of the town square with two other men. He caught sight of her and grinned, tipping an imaginary hat. "Didn't think you'd show," he said as she approached. Lottie smirked. "You underestimate my stubbornness, Mr. Parker." "Wouldn't dream of it." They spent the morning pulling weeds, scrubbing down storefronts, repainting faded signs. The work was hard, sweaty, and utterly satisfying. Lottie laughed more that day than she had in months, maybe years. When the paint roller slipped from her hand and splattered bright blue across Evan's jeans, he retaliated by dabbing a streak of white across her nose. The townsfolk cheered them on, their laughter mingling with the smell of fresh paint and hope. It was messy and imperfect. It was wonderful. As the sun dipped low, casting the town in a golden glow, the group gathered outside Maggie's for cold lemonade and homemade pie. Carol Lawson raised her glass, her voice strong despite the years etched into her face. "To Cedar Hollow," she declared, "still kicking, thanks to folks who don't know how to quit." Cheers erupted, and Lottie felt herself swept into it, no longer an outsider peeking through a window, but a part of something real, something that mattered. She caught Evan's gaze across the crowd, and he gave her a small, private smile, one that said more than words ever could. In that moment, Lottie realized she wasn't just helping revive a town. She was reviving something inside herself, too. Later, when the square had emptied and the last pie crumbs had been wiped away, Evan and Lottie found themselves lingering beneath the old street lamp outside the garage. The air was cool and soft, scented with fresh paint and cut grass. "Thanks for today," Evan said, his voice low. "It meant a lot." Lottie shrugged, a little embarrassed. I should be thanking you, she said. You in this town, you reminded me what real life looks like. Shuri. They stood there, the silence between them thick with things unsaid. Finally, Evan reached out, brushing a speck of paint from her cheek with the pad of his thumb. His touch was light, almost hesitant. You're a part of it now, he said. Lottie swallowed against the lump rising in her throat. Maybe I want to be, she whispered. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just the two of them, standing in the fading light, hearts beating loud enough to drown out the cicadas. Maybe it wasn't love, not yet, but it was something strong and alive and growing by the day. And sometimes, Lottie thought, that was even better. The days following the town cleanup felt lighter somehow, as if Cedar Hollow had shaken off a bit of its dust and found a reason to breathe again. Evan noticed it everywhere. The way people lingered longer over coffee, the way kids chased each other across the town square, the way the old men on the bench outside the barber shop laughed louder. And then there was Lottie. She was everywhere lately, repainting the library sign, helping Carol organize a bake sale, waving at passing cars like she'd been here her whole life. It didn't seem to matter that she wasn't from Cedar Hollow. She belonged somehow. She fit. And Evan, much as he tried not to, found himself fitting her into the quiet spaces of his life too. One warm afternoon, Evan was elbow deep in the engine of a dusty Chevrolet when he heard the familiar crunch of gravel outside the garage. He wiped his hands on a rag and straightened up just as Lottie appeared in the doorway, her hair pulled back in a loose braid, a basket of sandwiches in her arms. I figured you might forget to eat again, she said, flashing him a teasing smile. Evan chuckled, setting his wrench aside. You figured right. She hopped up onto the workbench, swinging her legs as she unpacked the basket. Turkey sandwiches, fresh lemonade, and slices of apple pie that smelled suspiciously like Maggie's handiwork. They ate together in companionable silence, the radio in the corner softly playing an old country tune. So, Lottie said between bites, any exciting plans for the weekend? Evan shrugged. Same as always. Fix what's broken. Keep the lights on. She smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in it. You ever think about doing something different? He looked at her then, really looked, the way her eyes shone with a kind of restless hope, the way her voice held a thread of longing she couldn't quite hide. I used to, he said slowly, but dreams cost money, and I never had much to spare. Lottie nodded, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the workbench. You shouldn't have to give up dreaming, she said. Yeah, Evan said, a small, rueful smile tugging at his mouth. Well, sometimes life has other plans. She opened her mouth to reply, but before she could, the garage door creaked open again. Afternoon, Evan, called a voice. It was Paul Jensen, the local real estate agent, a stocky man with a habit of talking too loud and knowing too much. And you must be Miss Whitmore, Paul said, turning his beady gaze to Lottie. Been hearing your name around town. Evan stiffened, something in Paul's tone setting his teeth on edge. Lottie smiled politely. Word travels fast, I guess. Paul chuckled. Especially when it's attached to Whitmore Holdings. Big name. Big money. The words hung heavy in the air. Evan blinked, feeling as if he'd been punched square in the gut. Whitmore Holdings. He knew that name. Everyone in the state did. Real estate empires, skyscrapers, luxury developments. Whitmore Holdings wasn't just big, it was untouchable. He turned to Lottie, who was suddenly very still, her sandwich forgotten in her lap. It's true, he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. She looked at him then, and he saw it. The guilt, the fear, the wall she hadn't wanted to build but had built anyway. I didn't lie, she said softly. I just didn't say everything. Paul, sensing the tension, gave a sheepish grin and backed out quickly, mumbling something about a meeting across town. The moment he was gone, Evan set his sandwich down carefully. So what is it? He asked. You're not just passing through, are you? Lottie swallowed hard. No, she admitted. I ran away. She slid off the workbench, standing there like someone ready to take a blow. My father wants me to marry a man I barely know, to merge our families, our businesses, like it's some kind of transaction. Evan stared at her, the pieces falling together with sickening clarity. You're an heiress, he said. You could buy this whole town 10 times over. I don't want to, she said fiercely. I don't want money, Evan. I want something real, something that isn't bought or traded or arranged. He raked a hand through his hair, feeling anger and confusion and hurt all colliding inside him. And what? He asked, bitterness creeping into his voice. You thought you'd slum it with a poor mechanic for a while? Play house in the small town until you got bored? Lottie flinched as if he'd struck her. It's not like that, she whispered. I didn't plan any of this. I just, I found something here. Something I didn't even know I was missing. Evan turned away, gripping the edge of the workbench so hard his knuckles whitened. He wanted to believe her. God, he wanted to. But the old voices were loud, the ones that said he wasn't good enough, that he was a fool to think someone like her could ever really stay. I'm sorry, Lottie said, her voice breaking. I should have told you. The weight of her words hung between them, thick and heavy. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Evan straightened, wiping his hands again, even though they were already clean. I need to get back to work, he said, his voice flat. Lottie hesitated, wanting to say something more, to fix it, but she saw the steel in his eyes and knew the door was closed, at least for now. Nodding slowly, she picked up the empty basket and left without another word. Evan watched her go, the ache in his chest deep and hollow. He told himself it was better this way, safer. But as he turned back to the empty garage, the silence screamed otherwise. The days that followed moved with a heaviness Evan hadn't felt in years. Work became a refuge. He buried himself in repairs, in oil changes, in the endless rhythm of engines and grease. Anything to keep his mind from wandering back to the woman with the storm in her eyes and the name that didn't belong to a dusty town like Cedar Hollow. But no matter how hard he worked, no matter how many engines he fixed, Lottie Whitmore lingered. In the way the sunlight slanted through the garage door in the late afternoon, in the smell of coffee he found himself brewing out of habit, in the empty space beside him where laughter used to fill the silence. It wasn't just her money that gnawed at him, it was what it represented. A world he didn't belong to, a life he could never touch. He had spent too long building walls around himself to survive the quiet ache of loneliness. Letting her in had felt dangerous from the start. Loving her, that was a risk he hadn't been ready to take. And now it felt like a mistake he couldn't undo. Across town, Lottie sat on the rickety bed in her rented room above the diner, staring out the window at the gathering twilight. She hadn't seen Evan since that afternoon in the garage. He hadn't come by Maggie's. He hadn't answered the texts she sent, short messages that she deleted and retyped a dozen times before hitting send. I'm sorry. I should have told you. Please let me explain. The only reply was silence. She wrapped her arms around her knees, feeling smaller than she had in years. How foolish she'd been, thinking she could leave her old world behind so easily, that she could step into a life built on handshakes and hard work and trust without dragging the shadows of her past with her. She had wanted so badly to be seen for who she was, not what she came from, and Evan had seen her, the real her. That's what made it hurt so much. She wasn't sure what scared her more, losing him or realizing how deeply she had already fallen. The next morning, unable to sit still any longer, Lottie wandered into the heart of town. The streets were mostly quiet, the usual slow Sunday buzz of Cedar Hollow life, families heading to church, old men gathering at the cafe for their ritual debates over politics and baseball. She ended up at Miller's Pond again, the place where so much had shifted between them without either of them saying a word. The water was still today, mirroring the cloudless sky above. She picked up a stone, running her thumb along its smooth surface. I'm not who you think I am, she whispered to no one. And maybe that was the problem. Maybe she wasn't even sure who she was anymore. Meanwhile, back at Parker's auto, Evan wrestled with the same battle. He told himself he was better off alone, that dreams didn't put food on the table, that love didn't fix broken engines or pay overdue bills. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. He missed her. Not the heiress, not the name. Her. The woman who showed up with coffee and paint-streaked jeans. The woman who laughed at his terrible jokes and saw a future in a town everyone else had given up on. The woman who had made him believe for a moment that maybe he wasn't stuck, that maybe life still had something more to offer than survival. By afternoon, he couldn't stay in the garage any longer. Without letting himself think too hard about it, Evan locked up and drove. The roads out to Miller's Pond were nearly empty, sunlight filtering through the trees in golden shafts. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh beginnings. When he arrived, he spotted her immediately, sitting on the dock, legs dangling over the water, her hair gleaming in the sun. He sat there in the truck for a long minute, hands gripping the wheel, the engine ticking as it cooled. "You're a fool, Parker," he thought. "But maybe some things are worth being foolish for." He killed the engine and stepped out, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. Lottie turned at the sound, her face a study in cautious hope. Neither of them spoke right away. The air between them was fragile, straining under the weight of all the things unsaid. Finally, Evan shoved his hands into his pockets and said, "You ran away from something you hated, not because you were looking for someone like me." Lottie opened her mouth to protest, but he shook his head. "Let me finish," he said. He took a few steps closer, standing at the edge of the dock. "You came here because you needed a place to breathe, a place to remember who you are without all the noise." He paused, searching her eyes. "And maybe I needed that too." Lottie's breath caught. "I never meant to lie to you," she said, her voice trembling. I wanted to be normal. I wanted to matter for something other than my last name." Evan nodded slowly. "You do." Two simple words, no fanfare, no sweeping declarations, but they hit harder than anything else could have. Lottie stood wiping her hands nervously on her jeans. "I'm still figuring it out," she said. "Who I want to be, where I belong." Evan gave a small, lopsided smile. "Sounds like you're in good company," he said. "Town's been figuring itself out for years." They both laughed then, the tension easing a fraction. Evan took another step forward. "I don't know what this is," he admitted. "I don't know where it goes." Lottie's eyes filled with something bright and raw and beautiful. "Me neither," she whispered. He held out his hand, palm open, offering, not demanding, not promising, just offering. She didn't hesitate. Her fingers slid into his, warm and certain. And for the first time in a long, long while, both of them let go of the fear long enough to hold on to something real. Monday morning broke over Cedar Hollow with a shy sun peeking through thin clouds. Evan stood in the garage doorway, sipping burnt coffee from his favorite chipped mug, watching the light spread over Main Street like a quiet promise. It had been 2 days since he and Lottie had met at Miller's Pond. 2 days of tentative, careful hope threading between them like fragile gold. They hadn't made plans, hadn't rushed into anything. Just small gestures, a coffee left on a counter, a smile across a room, small signs that the door was open again. And Evan found that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as afraid as he once was. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Still drinking that motor oil you call coffee, Parker?" Evan turned to see an old man leaning against the doorframe, a wide grin creasing his weathered face. It was Frank Delaney, one of his mother's oldest friends and one of the few people left in Cedar Hollow who had known Evan since he was a boy. "Frank," Evan said, smiling, "what brings you by?" Frank shrugged, his denim jacket hanging loose on his thin frame. "Thought I'd see if you still remember how to fix a carburetor," he said with a wink. "And maybe," his tone grew softer, "maybe tell you something I should have said a long time ago." Evan frowned, setting down his mug. "You all right?" Frank nodded, stepping inside. His limp was a little worse than Evan remembered, but his spirit was undiminished. "I was cleaning out some old boxes," Frank said, lowering himself carefully onto a stool. "Found some letters. From your mom." Evan's heart gave a sharp, involuntary tug. Frank pulled a weathered envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it over. "I figured you should have this." Evan took it with reverence, the paper soft and fragile under his calloused fingers. His mother's handwriting stared up at him, strong, familiar, achingly missed. He swallowed hard and opened the envelope. The letter wasn't long. It was dated a few months before his mother passed, written in the uneven scrawl of someone fighting against failing strength. "My dearest Evan, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And knowing you, you're probably carrying more weight than you should. I need you to remember something, son. You were never meant to just survive. You were meant to live, to love, to hope. Don't let the hard days harden your heart. There's still beauty in this world, still kindness worth giving, still dreams worth chasing. And you, my sweet boy, you are enough." You always have been. With all my love, Mom. Evan blinked rapidly against the sting in his eyes. For a long moment, he just sat there, the letter trembling in his hands. Frank clapped a gentle hand on his shoulder. She was proud of you, he said gruffly. Never stopped saying it, even when the bills piled up, even when she knew what you were sacrificing. Evan nodded, unable to speak. Frank smiled sadly. She didn't want you chained to this place out of guilt, he said. She wanted you to choose your life, not just inherit it. Evan folded the letter carefully, tucking it into his breast pocket like armor. Thank you, he said finally, his voice thick. Frank stood, patting Evan's back with a heavy hand. You still got a whole life ahead of you, Parker, he said. Don't waste it looking backward. And with that, he shuffled out into the sunlight, leaving Evan alone with a heart fuller and heavier than it had been in a long time. That evening, Evan found himself back at Miller's Pond, the letter burning against his chest like a brand. The pond was glassy and still, the reeds whispering in the soft breeze. He sat on the dock, staring out over the water, feeling the weight of his mother's words settle into his bones. You are enough. How long had he lived thinking otherwise? How many dreams had he buried under the belief that he wasn't worth more? He thought about Cedar Hollow, the people who stayed not because it was easy, but because it mattered. He thought about the garage, about every stubborn, sputtering engine he'd coaxed back to life with patience and care. He thought about Lottie, about her laughter, her determination, her open, wounded heart. Maybe life wasn't about running or staying. Maybe it was about choosing hope over fear, choosing to build even when everything seemed broken, choosing love even when it terrified you. As the first stars blinked into existence overhead, Evan stood, brushing dust from his jeans. The town needed people who believed in it, and maybe, just maybe, so did he. He wasn't trapped here. He was rooted here. There was a difference. Later that night, as he closed up the garage, Evan paused by the counter where Lottie had once set down a basket of sandwiches and lemonade. Smiling to himself, he pulled out a scrap of paper and scribbled 2 words. Thank you. He left it tucked into the bouquet of wildflowers she'd brought by days ago. A silent promise that he wasn't running anymore. Not from Cedar Hollow, and not from her. The first sign of change came quietly. One morning, Evan pulled into town to find Lottie standing in front of the old general store, a clipboard tucked under her arm, her brow furrowed in determined concentration. She was talking animatedly with Mr. Hanley, the retired teacher who still organized the town's 4th of July parade. Evan watched from a distance, sipping his coffee, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Something was brewing, and whatever it was, Lottie Whitmore was right at the center of it. Later that day, she found him at the garage. Got a minute? She asked, a spark in her eyes he hadn't seen in anyone since, well, maybe since his mother. He set down his wrench and wiped his hands. For you, always. She rolled her eyes, but her smile softened. I have an idea, she said. A crazy one. Maybe even a stupid one. Evan leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. Lay it on me. Lottie hesitated for just a moment, then plunged ahead. I want to reopen the general store, she said. Not as a big fancy thing, just a place where people can get what they need without driving an hour. Maybe add a little cafe corner, some shelves for local crafts, a bulletin board for community events. Evan raised an eyebrow. You planning to run it yourself? She grinned sheepishly. Well, not alone. I was hoping it could be a community project. Everyone pitching in, everyone having a stake. He studied her for a long moment, the weight of what she was proposing settling between them. You're serious, he said finally. As a heart attack, she said. Evan chuckled despite himself. And you think Cedar Hollow's got enough left in it to make that work? Lottie's eyes didn't waver. I think it has more heart than half the cities I've ever lived in, she said quietly. It just needs a little help remembering. In the weeks that followed, Cedar Hollow woke up. It started with the general store. Lottie negotiated with the absentee owner, a former resident who was more than happy to sell the building for a fraction of its worth just to avoid paying taxes on it. Then came the volunteers. Carol Lawson organized a cleaning crew. Pastor Jim rallied the teenagers from the youth group to repaint the walls. Maggie from the diner promised pies and sandwiches to keep the workers fueled. And Evan. He showed up every morning before sunrise, toolbox in hand, helping repair broken shelves, rewire old fixtures, and mend the battered front steps. No one made speeches. No one asked for thanks. They just showed up, day after day, bringing hammers and paintbrushes and casseroles and a stubborn, scrappy kind of hope. One afternoon, as Evan and Lottie painted the front windows together, she paused, brush poised in midair. "You ever think," she said, "that maybe kindness is contagious?" Evan smirked. "You're saying we're starting an epidemic?" She laughed, the sound bright and easy. "Could be worse," she said. "We could all be stuck being bitter instead." Evan's smile faded into something softer, something real. "You did this," he said quietly. Lottie shook her head. "No, we did this. You, me, the whole town." She set her brush down and looked at him, serious now. "But Evan, you started it too. That night you came out into the rain, when you could have stayed home, when you didn't have to help me." He shrugged, embarrassed. "It was just a dead battery." "No," she said, stepping closer. "It was kindness, and it changed everything." He met her gaze, the truth of her words settling in deep, anchoring him in a way nothing had for years. Maybe miracles didn't come with trumpets and fanfare. Maybe they came with wrenches and paintbrushes and open hands. By early May, the grand reopening was ready. They hung a hand-painted sign above the door. Cedar Hollow Mercantile, a place for everyone. The whole town turned out. Families with strollers, teenagers in Sunday best, retirees with canes and weathered smiles. Lottie wore a simple dress, her hair pulled back with a ribbon, looking more like a hometown girl than any heiress. Evan stood beside her, hands tucked awkwardly in his pockets, heart thudding harder than he cared to admit. Carol Lawson gave a short, teary speech. Pastor Jim said a blessing. And when Lottie cut the ribbon with an oversized pair of scissors borrowed from the school theater department, the cheers echoed down Main Street. Inside, the store bustled with life. Shelves lined with handmade goods, a corner cafe buzzing with chatter and laughter, a community bulletin board already filling with notes about lost dogs, bake sales, and softball games. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't perfect. It was home. Later, as the sun dipped low and the town began to drift back to their evening routines, Evan found Lottie sitting on the front steps, barefoot, her shoes kicked off beside her. He sat down next to her, close enough that their shoulders brushed. "You did good," he said gruffly. "So did you," she replied. They sat there in comfortable silence, watching the fireflies wink to life across the square. Finally, Lottie spoke. "I don't know what comes next," she said, her voice soft. "I don't have a plan. For once." Evan smiled, reaching out to take her hand, his fingers rough and warm against hers. "Sometimes," he said, "the best things start that way." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he let her, feeling a peace settle over him that he hadn't known he'd been missing. For the first time in years, Evan Parker wasn't just fixing broken things. He was building something new, something lasting. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most miraculous thing of all. Autumn arrived quietly in Cedar Hollow, like a lover slipping into a familiar bed. The leaves turned first, a slow-burning fire of amber and gold that swept through the town's trees, lining the streets with a carpet of color. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and ripe apples. And every morning Evan woke to a world edged with frost, the grass sparkling like a field of tiny stars. It was the kind of season that made you believe in second chances. One Saturday afternoon, Lottie suggested a drive out to Miller's Pond. "No real reason," she said, "just a whim." But Evan sensed something deeper stirring behind her smile. He agreed without hesitation. They drove Evan's old pickup along winding country roads, past fields stripped bare after harvest, past barns leaning against the sky like tired old men. When they reached the pond, it was almost unrecognizable from the summer months. The water was a sheet of molten silver, reflecting the tapestry of crimson and gold that lined the shore. The old dock creaked gently in the breeze. It felt like a painting too beautiful to touch. Lottie stepped out of the truck, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Her breath puffed in little clouds as she looked around, a soft smile playing at her lips. Evan watched her for a moment before following. "This place looks different," she said, her voice low with wonder. "Everything changes," he said, stepping beside her. She nodded, her gaze distant. Some things change, she said. Some things finally grow into what they were always meant to be. There was a tremor in her voice that made Evan's chest tighten. They wandered toward the old maple tree at the edge of the water, a giant gnarled thing whose branches stretched wide and low, heavy with flaming leaves. Beneath it, the world felt still, sacred. Lottie turned to him then, her hands buried deep in her coat pockets. I need to tell you something, she said. Evan's heart hammered against his ribs. She took a breath, steadying herself. My father found me, she said. He sent a letter. Evan stiffened but said nothing, giving her space to continue. He wants me to come back. Said it's not too late to fix things. The marriage deal. The company. She laughed softly, bitterly. All it would take is giving up everything I've built here. Everything I've started to believe in. Evan swallowed hard, fear clawing up his spine. Are you thinking about it? He asked, hating how small his voice sounded. Lottie looked at him. Really looked. Her eyes full of something fierce and aching. I thought about it, she admitted. For a minute. The easy way. The safe way. She stepped closer, the leaves crunching beneath her boots. But then I thought about Cedar Hollow, she said. I thought about the store, and Maggie's coffee, and the way Carol laughs when she's trying not to cry. I thought about this town fighting to find its heart again. She paused, her voice breaking. And I thought about you. Evan couldn't move, could barely breathe. Lottie took one more step forward until they were standing close enough that he could see the fine tremble of her hands. I don't want a life measured by mergers and bank accounts, she said. I want a life built on mornings at the diner and late nights fixing old engines and sunsets like this one. She reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his with a desperate kind of tenderness. I want a life with you, Evan. The words hung there, trembling in the golden light. Evan stared at her, the woman who had stumbled into his life on a rainy night and turned his world quietly, irrevocably inside out. And then he smiled. A real, unguarded smile that felt like breathing for the first time in years. You sure about that? He asked, voice rough with emotion. This life's messy, hard, ain't much fancy about it. She laughed through her tears. I don't want fancy, she said. I want real. Evan squeezed her hand, feeling his heart settle into a rhythm he hadn't realized it had been missing. Then you're stuck with me, he said. Good, she whispered. They sat beneath the maple tree as the sun sank low, painting the sky in brushstrokes of fire and rose. No grand promises, no need for them. Just the quiet certainty of two people who had fought their way back to hope and found each other waiting there. At one point, Evan pulled a small object from his jacket pocket, a silver ring, simple and unadorned. It had been his mother's. He hadn't planned this, hadn't even thought it through, but somehow it felt right. He turned the ring over in his palm, then looked at Lottie. I don't have a speech, he said gruffly. She smiled through her tears. I don't need one. Slowly, he slipped the ring onto her finger. It didn't glitter like the diamonds her father would have offered. It didn't need to. It shone with something stronger, something real, something they had built together, piece by fragile piece. As the last light faded and the stars blinked awake overhead, Evan and Lottie sat hand in hand beneath the maple tree, the world quiet around them. No doubts, no fears, just a love sturdy enough to weather whatever storms might come. And that was enough. It was more than enough. Spring returned to Cedar Hollow like a whispered promise. The trees shook off their winter sleep, budding in tender greens. The streets buzzed with gentle energy, the kind that grew not from grand events, but from everyday miracles. Laughter spilling from Maggie's place, kids chasing kites across the town square, the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings in the air. And in the center of it all stood Evan and Lottie, side by side, hearts steady, hands entwined. They spent their mornings at the Cedar Hollow Mercantile, the little store that had become the town's heartbeat. Lottie ran the front counter, a familiar face to every regular who wandered in for a loaf of bread or a bag of nails. Evan kept busy in the back, fixing what needed fixing. Coffee makers, bicycles, the occasional stubborn washing machine brought in by desperate neighbors. In the afternoons, they would sneak away for long walks down country lanes or stolen moments by Miller's Pond, where the world seemed to fall away and leave only the two of them behind. Life was not glamorous. It was better. It was theirs. One afternoon in late May, Cedar Hollow gathered once again, this time for the first community festival the town had seen in over a decade. Bunting hung from lampposts. Children ran barefoot through the grass. Carol Lawson presided over the pie contest with all the solemnity of a Supreme Court justice. Evan stood by the grill, flipping burgers, while Lottie manned a booth offering homemade jams and hand-stitched quilts. It wasn't perfect. The speaker system kept cutting out. The lemonade stand ran dry too soon, but the laughter and chatter filling the square told a different story. A story of a town that had remembered how to hope. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in hues of peach and gold, Pastor Jim tapped the microphone, his voice booming over the crackling speakers. Before we wrap up this beautiful day, I think it's only fitting we acknowledge a few folks who've helped bring Cedar Hollow back to life. He paused, smiling warmly. Evan Parker, Charlotte Whitmore. Would you two come up here? The crowd erupted into cheers and applause. Blushing furiously, Evan shook his head, but Lottie grabbed his hand and tugged him toward the makeshift stage. Standing there under a sky stitched with the first stars of evening, they faced the town they had helped rebuild. Not with grand speeches or bottomless wallets, but with something far rarer: kindness, faith, love. Pastor Jim continued, his voice thick with emotion. We're grateful, he said simply, for reminding us that no town is too small, no dream too foolish, and no heart too broken to find its way home again. Tears pricked at Lottie's eyes, and when Evan squeezed her hand, she knew he felt the same. They didn't need words. The town's joy wrapped around them, as real and solid as any promise. Later, after the last pie crumbs had been eaten and the last fireflies chased, Evan and Lottie walked slowly back toward the garage. The night air was cool, sweet with the scent of clover and lilac. Evan stopped near the steps, turning to face her. You happy? He asked quietly. Lottie smiled, radiant and sure. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Lottie gasped, covering her mouth with trembling fingers. Evan opened it to reveal a simple gold band, elegant in its honesty. No rush, he said gruffly, his voice shaking just enough to betray his nerves. No big wedding unless you want one. No expectations. Just me, you, this town, this life. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her smile never wavered. Yes, she whispered, before he could even ask the question. He slid the ring onto her finger, his hand steady despite the flood of emotion surging through him. And then he kissed her. There, under the stars, on the cracked sidewalk outside the garage he once thought he would die in, alone. It was a kiss full of promises, of new beginnings, of home. The years ahead wouldn't be perfect. They knew that. There would be leaky roofs and broken coffee machines and harsh winters that buried the town in snow. There would be arguments over burnt dinners and late nights spent balancing ledgers by the glow of the old lamp in the store window. But there would also be laughter, and soft mornings tangled in warm sheets, and seasons that turned like pages in a well-loved book. Most of all, there would be the simple, stubborn kind of love that didn't need grand declarations to prove it was real. A love that grew not in sudden flashes, but in quiet, steady roots. And so, in a small town forgotten by most maps, beneath skies brushed with gold and purple, Evan Parker and Charlotte Whitmore built a life. A real life. Messy. Beautiful. Theirs. A life made not from riches or fame, but from kindness offered, trust earned, and love chosen. Every single day. A life that proved that sometimes the smallest acts of goodness can grow into the greatest miracles. A life that, at long last, felt like home. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We always enjoy seeing how far our little storytelling community reaches. If you enjoyed this story and would like to hear more heartwarming tales about kindness, love, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support truly means the world to us and helps keep these beautiful stories alive. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep believing in the magic of everyday moments.